Pick up a stick of butter in an American grocery store and pick up a block of butter in a French, Irish, or Danish one, and you are legally and technically holding two different products, not similar products with a different name. Two products that don't meet the same legal definition of what butter actually has to contain. The difference comes down to a single number, and it's smaller than you'd expect for something that changes how butter bakes, how it tastes, and how it behaves in a pan. But once you understand that one number, you'll understand why so many serious home bakers specifically seek out European-style butter, and why that phrase means something real, not just a marketing flourish. Let's start with the US side. Under federal law, specifically a standard first established roughly a century ago and still essentially unchanged today, the FDA Standard of Identity for butter requires a minimum of 80% milk fat. That's it. That's the legal bar. A product can be labeled butter in the United States as long as it's made exclusively from milk or cream, is pasteurized, and hits that 80% milk fat threshold with the remaining roughly 20% split between water and milk solids. The European Union standard, set under its Common Market Organization regulation, requires a minimum of 82% milk fat, with tighter caps on water content and non-fat milk solids than the US standard specifies. That 2-point gap sounds small. In practice, it's the difference between a product that's roughly 1/5 water and milk solids by volume, and one that's meaningfully closer to pure fat, with real measurable consequences for anyone who bakes with it. Water is the operative word here because water is what butter's higher fat content is actually displacing. More fat means less water, and less water changes butter's behavior in ways that professional bakers and pastry chefs have understood for a very long time, even if most home cooks never learn why. It's worth understanding why laminated dough is such a demanding test for butter in the first place, because it explains why professional pastry kitchens care about this fat percentage so specifically, rather than treating all butter as interchangeable. When butter is folded into dough for something like croissants, it needs to stay pliable and cold enough to remain in distinct, unbroken layers through repeated rolling and folding, rather than either cracking apart or melting into the surrounding dough. Butter with a higher fat and lower water content has a wider workable temperature range. For this kind of lamination, professional bakers sometimes describe it as being more plastic, meaning it bends and folds cleanly rather than tearing, over a broader range of kitchen temperatures. Lower fat, higher water butter has a narrower window where it behaves that way, which is part of why French pastry technique, developed entirely around the higher European fat standard, can be genuinely harder to replicate with standard American butter without adjusting technique, chilling times, or fold counts to compensate for the different behavior. Take laminated dough, the kind used for croissants and puff pastry, where butter gets folded into dough in thin layers over and over, creating that flaky, layered structure when it bakes. Butter with more water content is more prone to tearing during that folding process, and the water converts to steam unevenly during baking, which can compromise the crisp, distinct layers that make good laminated pastry work. Higher fat European-style butter holds together better through repeated folding and produces more consistent, more defined layers in the oven, which is a big part of why French and other European pastry traditions built their techniques around butter that was already higher in fat than what became the American industrial standard. Pie crust tells a similar story. Butter's water content, when it hits a hot oven, flashes to steam, and that steam is actually what creates flakiness in a pie crust. Small pockets of butter melting and releasing steam between layers of flour. Higher fat butter, ironically, can produce an even more tender, more consistently flaky crust, specifically because there's less water diluting the fat's structural role in the dough, and the fat itself distributes more evenly. And then there's the simplest version of this, just melting butter in a pan for cooking. Higher fat butter spatters less and browns more evenly, again because there's less water flashing off as it heats, and butter's characteristic browning, the nutty, toasted flavor you get from browned butter, beurre noisette in French cooking, develops from the milk solids and fat interacting with heat, a reaction that plays out slightly differently depending on how much water is competing for that same heat energy. So why did the US standard end up at 80% while Europe settled at 82? Part of the answer is genuinely just regulatory history rather than any deliberate quality decision. The US standard was set in the early 20th century, largely to prevent butter adulteration with cheaper fats and to establish a clear legal floor during a period when dairy fraud was a real and common problem, and 80% became the number that stuck, carried forward with only minor adjustments for the century since. It wasn't set as an aspirational quality target, it was set as a fraud prevention minimum. And once codified into federal regulation, changing it would require an entirely new rulemaking process that nobody in the US dairy industry has had strong incentive to push for, since the lower threshold is easier and cheaper for large-scale manufacturers to consistently hit. There's a second, quieter difference worth knowing about, and it's less about the legal minimum and more about tradition: culturing. Traditional European butter making, especially in France, developed around cultured cream that's been allowed to ferment slightly with live bacterial cultures before churning, similar in spirit to yogurt or crème fraîche, which gives the finished butter a slightly tangy, more complex flavor beyond simple dairy richness. This wasn't originally a deliberate craft choice so much as a practical one. Before modern refrigeration, cream naturally began fermenting on the way from farm to churn, and European butter making traditions built around and eventually intentionally replicated that natural process. American industrial dairy production, developing later and with better refrigeration infrastructure available from an earlier stage, standardized around sweet cream butter made from fresh, unfermented cream, which produces a cleaner, simpler dairy flavor without the tang. Most mass-market American butter today is still sweet cream style, while cultured butter remains the traditional standard across much of continental Europe, though it's become more available as a specialty product in the US in recent years. There's a third layer here that connects directly back to something we covered a few videos ago: geographic protection. Just as certain Italian tomatoes carry a legally protected designation that limits who can use that specific name, several European butters carry similar protected status. Beurre d'Isigny and Beurre Charente Poitou in France, for example, both hold Appellation d'origine protégée status, meaning the name is legally restricted to butter produced in a specific region using specific methods, under specific oversight, the same legal framework that protects Champagne or Parmigiano Reggiano. There's no equivalent US federal system that legally restricts a butter name to a specific American region and production method in the same enforceable way, which means the concept of a protected, place-specific butter identity, verified and enforced by law rather than just marketing language, is something that exists in EU regulation with no direct American parallel. There's one more piece of the protected designation system worth walking through because it shows how far the enforcement mechanism actually reaches compared to anything equivalent in the US. A product carrying AOP status like Beurre d'Isigny isn't just restricted by name. The designation legally ties the entire production process to specific geographic and methodological requirements, covering everything from which pastures the dairy cows can graze on, to minimum aging and churning specifications, to inspection and certification bodies that verify compliance on an ongoing basis, not just at the point a product first earns the designation. Producers found violating those terms can lose certification entirely, and using a protected name without qualifying certification is a genuine legal violation across the EU, enforceable in a way that goes well beyond a simple trademark dispute. The US has nothing structurally equivalent for a regional dairy product. There's no federal system that ties a butter name to a specific American region's soil, grazing practices, and production method with that same binding legal force, which means the entire concept of a protected culinary place name, common and actively enforced across French, Italian, and several other European food traditions, doesn't really have a domestic American parallel outside a small number of narrower trademark and appellation cases, mostly limited to wine and spirits. Now here's where this connects to a pattern you've probably started noticing across this whole channel. American consumers didn't just wait around for the FDA to raise its butter standard. The market did what it's done with RBST-free milk, bromate-free bread, and paraben-free cosmetics, and it created a voluntary higher-tier category in response to demand, entirely independent of any change to the federal minimum. European-style butter is now a widely recognized product category in American grocery stores, sold by brands including Kerrygold, imported directly from Ireland, and domestic American producers like Plugra, and various premium store brands, many of which are made in the US specifically to hit that 82% or higher fat threshold, marketed explicitly around the baking and flavor benefits we just walked through. The federal minimum never moved. The market simply built a better product on top of it once enough consumers, largely driven by home bakers and professional pastry influence, started asking for it by name. There's one more difference worth a quick mention because it echoes something from our dairy video a few episodes back. Some traditional European butters, particularly certain protected French varieties, are made from raw, unpasteurized cream, consistent with the same raw dairy traditions we discussed with raw milk cheese. U.S. federal regulation requires butter made for interstate commerce to be made from pasteurized cream, so that specific raw cream tradition, like unaged raw milk cheese, generally isn't something you'll find in an authentic form on American shelves, regardless of fat content or culturing style. There's a color detail worth knowing too, because it's one of the more surprising things about how standardized American butter's appearance actually is. Butter's natural color comes from beta-carotene in the cow's diet, which means genuinely unprocessed butter varies in color throughout the year, paler in winter when cows eat more stored feed, more golden yellow in spring and summer when they're grazing fresh grass rich in that pigment. Most large-scale American butter producers add annatto, a natural plant-based coloring extracted from achiote seeds, specifically to flatten out that seasonal variation and deliver a consistent golden yellow color in every stick, every month of the year, regardless of what the cows were actually eating. This isn't unique to the US. Annatto is permitted and used in parts of Europe too, but the American dairy industry's emphasis on year-round color consistency as a baseline consumer expectation is more pronounced, in part because a paler, more seasonally variable butter can read to an American shopper as somehow lower quality, even though color has no bearing on the butter's actual fat content, flavor, or freshness. Salt content is a smaller but related variable worth mentioning. Both US and EU butter come in salted and unsalted versions, but there's no equivalent federal standard in either system precisely dictating salt percentage the way milk fat content is regulated. It varies by producer, and European salted butters, particularly from Brittany's beurre de Barat tradition, have historically trended toward a noticeably higher, more pronounced salt level than typical American salted butter, sometimes even including visible flakes of sea salt as a textural and flavor feature. This is more of a regional culinary tradition than a hard regulatory divide, unlike the fat percentage question, but it's part of why a French salted butter can taste like a genuinely different product from an American one, even when both are labeled salted. It's also worth understanding the original purpose behind the US standard a little more, because it explains why 80% has proven so durable despite being lower than most of the developed world's equivalent standard. In the decades before federal food standards existed in any comprehensive form, butter adulteration was a widespread, well-documented problem. Manufacturers stretching real butter with cheaper animal fats, water, or early margarine blends and selling the result as pure butter, with no reliable way for a shopper to know the difference before buying. The federal butter standard was fundamentally a fraud prevention measure, establishing a clear, enforceable floor beneath which a product legally could not be called butter at all, at a time when that floor genuinely needed defending. It succeeded at that goal and has remained largely untouched since. Not because 80% represents some optimal quality target, but because the standard did exactly the job it was built for, and no strong industry or regulatory push has emerged in the century since to raise it purely for quality's sake, especially once the market solved the quality question on its own through the voluntary European-style category. So, practically, here's what to actually look for the next time you're standing in a dairy case. First, check the fat content specifically if it's listed. Most standard US butter sits right around 80%, while anything labeled European style should be sitting at 82% or higher, and premium imported butters sometimes run even higher than that, into the mid-80s. Second, if you want the tangier, more traditional flavor profile rather than just the higher fat content, look specifically for cultured butter on the label. Fat percentage and culturing are two independent variables, and a butter can be high fat without being cultured, or cultured without hitting the European fat minimum. So if a specific flavor profile matters more to you than baking performance, that's the phrase to look for. Third, for baking specifically, laminated doughs, pie crusts, anything where texture depends on butter's water content, the fat percentage is the number that actually matters most, more than the cultured versus sweet cream question. So prioritize checking for that 82% threshold if flakiness and lamination are your goal. This channel compares food and product standards across the US, UK, and EU using publicly available regulatory information including FDA, Standard of Identity regulations, EU, Common Market Organization regulation, and protected designation of origin registries. Content is for informational and entertainment purposes only. Regulations and product formulations change over time, so always check current labels and official sources for yourself. We are not affiliated with or endorsed by any brand, company, or organization mentioned. Next time, we're heading back into the pasta aisle, the legally protected Italian tomato that almost never actually makes it into the San Marzano sauce on your grocery shelf, and why that fraud is enforceable in Europe and essentially unregulated here. Subscribe if you want to see exactly how the label gets away with it.